I'll go ahead and get started. I just sort of put this group together. I'm certainly the least knowledgeable person in this meeting. I was actually in Chapel Hill when Helene hit. My other half ran back to take care of things in Swananoa for her parents, and then I guess stayed on the front lines for about 3 or 4 months. So I've got a lot of secondhand knowledge, not a lot of firsthand knowledge. But I have an amazing crew of folks here who make up for my knowledge gap with their experience and what they've got going on. So uh, if Scott, Chris, whichever one of you wants to start, and we'll make sure Brooks gets in as well.
Sure, I can jump in. Scott Berger at Allenstone Kilburn. I actually also was not on the front line with Helene since I operate our Winston-Salem office. So I'm in Winston-Salem. However, I do a lot of commercial real estate transactions, which usually involves a lot of lease negotiation and drafting. So I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the terms that you encounter in those, particularly the damage or destruction clauses, sometimes also called casualty clauses, that might be of interest. And on the back end of Helene, once the initial flood, poor choice of words, once the initial craziness ended, then it really got into a lot more of the negotiations for either uh, restorations or terminations of leases and those types of things. So I was navigating a lot of those for a number of different clients. And that's most of my experience with Helene and in general is in those clauses. So that's where all my experience is.
I guess I will jump in. I'm Chris Lewis, also with Alan Sullivan Kilborn. Um, Prior to moving to Asheville years ago, I lived and worked in the Triangle area, both right outside of Chapel Hill as well as in Raleigh, and went to UNC for undergrad. So I'm very familiar with the areas that were affected by the storm up there. Um, Job experience wise, I used to work for insurance defense firms, and in the process of doing that, have been handling storm related matters pretty much the majority of my career, um, from different sides, at different times. But in reviewing, one of the things we have to do is review insurance policies and look at claims that are made. And so I've been dealing with these things for the better part of 25, 27 years, uh, representing insurance companies that are looking at claims as well as people who are filing claims. Um, uh, Unlike Scott and Jamie, I do live in Asheville and receive the brunt of Helene, um, and have lots of clients up here in the general Western North Carolina area who've been dealing with storm related matters. And so it's, I won't say it's near and dear to our heart, but we definitely sympathize and understand what everybody in Chapel Hill is dealing with as a result of that storm and the issues with that. So um, it's something I've dealt with for a long time, and of late we are seeing a lot of issues related to storm matters and insurance coverage issues.
And Taylor, part of this is our give back because such amazing support came to Asheville from the Triangle, from Chapel Hill, and this is kind of giving some of it back.
And we love that. We love that. We've got one more, right?
Brooks,
Brooks?
Hey everyone. Thank you for having me with y'all today. I'm Brooks. At this point, have been focused on disaster work for the past 6 years, but exclusively in many ways. So I started off with Legal Aid of North Carolina, working primarily and only on disaster recovery issues for individuals. So I'd represent folks in claims against FEMA or against state programs, where they're seeking either grant funding or otherwise for mainly homeowner recovery, so home repairs and replacements. From there, I transitioned into private practice and focused more on business recovery, while on a pro bono level, continuing on with individual and homeowner assistance with disaster legal services, which is a program between the American Bar Association and FEMA. And then from there, I moved into state work. So I actually represented 2 state agencies. One no longer exists, unfortunately, it was consolidated. But I did work for the Disaster Recovery Division of the Office of State Budget and Management. That is technically housed up underneath the governor's office, which the governor's office is extremely involved in disaster recovery matters, particularly with navigating declarations at the state level and then navigating immediate response and requests up to the federal level. And then we transitioned into the Department of Public Safety as an agency. And so from there, I worked as an assistant general counsel, primarily representing the Department of Public Safety's Emergency Management Division. Throughout all of that, I continued my pro bono work under disaster legal services, helping homeowners and individuals. And so from that, I can tell you I've responded to hurricanes Florence, Matthew matters, Tropical Storm Fred in 2021, which was our first storm in the past decade, actually even quite before then, that impacted Western North Carolina. But not a lot of folks know that. I know Jamie does. But that was very small, localized storm to certain counties. I think it was through like Transylvania, Buncombe, and Haywood at that time. But it was the same type of damage that many of us now have experienced out west, from Hurricane Helene. And so for those who are in those counties, they unfortunately experienced the sort of a dual impact, what we call dual impact, where you've had 2 major disasters provide major damage within a short amount of time. So then, Hurricane Helene, of course, last year, we just came up on our 1-year anniversary of that impact date. And now with Chantal here in the middle of our state. So I've worked with FEMA very closely. I was on the ground during Hurricane Helene. I was essentially camping out west and out of my car and out of disaster recovery centers for the period between October, when we were released for assignments through FEMA to be on the ground. Because of the roadways and travelways, we weren't able to get out there quickly, like right after the disaster. But once roads opened up for not immediate response, but secondary response, we were able to get out there. I was out there through February, was my last physical assignment with FEMA. And then on a pro bono level, again, through disaster legal services, we've held various clinics and worked with businesses. So at this point, I'd say, I'm happy to speak to business matters if we want to talk about that today. General overview of disaster. I'd say I'm not exactly sure who might be watching this on playback, but folks who are nonprofit owners, business owners, or particularly folks in local units of government, how to navigate working at a local level with the state and federal level, and what types of programs are available. Happy to speak on any of that with y'all, but thank you again for having me.
Let me jump in on that, since that's sort of in my wheelhouse a little bit. It's actually a really good question, and it's unfortunately a question that most people ask in hindsight after something has happened and you're dealing with something like this. The best way for me, I think, to address this is to sort of walk you through a little bit of the process about what you need to do to avoid those pitfalls. First and foremost, anytime you're going to open up a business, the first thing you need to do is sit down with your insurance agent, whoever's selling you your commercial coverage for your business, and identify all of the areas that you need. One of the things with insurance policies you have to look at is what's covered, what's not covered, what causes of loss are applied, and what exemptions are in your policy. Insurance companies will stand on things that are not covered in their policies like it's the end of the world. So if things are not covered, they will deny claims. And so when you're talking to your agent, assume the worst. We live in the mountains of North Carolina. Who in a million years would have thought that we would have gotten clobbered by a hurricane in the mountains? So I believe the numbers were 98% of the affected businesses in Western North Carolina did not have flood coverage, which is pretty much everybody. And so all of the claims that come along with that, if it's no flood coverage available, insurance companies have been denying claims left and right. So for instance, in Eastgate, the area of Chapel Hill, it's a lower lying area. There's water sources around there. While you may never think that floods are going to happen, they do, as we unfortunately all know now. And so when you're looking at buying the coverage, think about what possible things do we need to have covered. And in some situations, and unfortunately, that's going to be flood coverage. You might never think you're going to need it, but when you do, you do. And so when you go through the claims process after an event like this has happened, the first thing you need to do is look at your insurance policy to see what's covered, what's not covered. And a big area that people have to identify is the cause of loss. And that is what caused the damage to my property or my inability to be open if you have a business interruption claim, something along those lines. And you really need to be specific to figure out what it is and why you were damaged or out of business for a particular period of time. Then you have to go back and link that to what the cause of loss was and whether that's covered under the terms of your policy. Insurance companies are very particular in identifying what the cause of loss is to determine whether it's covered under the policy or not. And there's also provisions in a lot of these policies that exempt coverage if the cause of loss is off-site, if it's not covered under your policy. So one of the things in Western North Carolina we've been dealing with a lot is people don't have, let's say they don't have flood coverage. Well, if their property wasn't flooded, but due to flooding, the power gets knocked out or the water system got knocked out, there are provisions in there that say off-site causes of loss will not be covered. So if you lost power because the power substation was flooded out, the insurance companies will say that's not a covered cause of loss. Or if you don't, like in Asheville, if you don't have water because the water system got taken out by a flood, they're saying you don't have coverage. And so when addressing those claims and presenting that information to your insurance company, people need to be as specific as possible about all aspects of what their claim entails, not just, oh, we lost power, so we weren't able to open. If there's multiple reasons for that, you need to be able to identify those. Another one has to do with civil authority interruption. If, for instance, if the town of Chapel Hill came and said, you can't access your property, it's still a disaster area, something like that. If the municipal authority does not allow you to access your property, that is another covered cause of loss that you have to put in your claim. So you want to put in every aspect of the claim, all of the damages associated with those, identify in your policy why it's covered, and then present all that information to the insurance company as thoroughly as possible. It's going to be a process. They typically are going to deny a lot of things initially, request additional documentation. You just need to be thorough. You need to document everything. You need to present it to them and expect some pushback and be ready to push back yourself. Very familiar with Eastgate. Been there lots and lots and lots of times over the years. A lot of insurance companies will look at things like that and they will evaluate the risk and the loss involved when issuing coverage. You can get flood coverage just about anywhere. The problem is the cost involved. If an area is in a known flood zone, getting flood insurance is going to be more expensive. Some carriers might not cover it. There's lots of insurance companies out there. You can always shop it around. Just assume that if it's in a known flood area, that flood insurance is going to cost a premium because of the likelihood of incidents happening. I don't think Eastgate has a documented history of flooding. It's certainly in an area that's probably flood prone under the right circumstances. Um, so I would just suggest, talk to your insurance broker, see what they can offer, see what other carriers are willing to do, if whether they're willing to write the policies, but just be aware that the cost is going to be higher than normal. They're going to put a premium on the flood insurance if it's a known flood area. If it's not a known flood area, the flood policy provisions are probably going to be fairly normal um, until something like this happens. I would anticipate that anybody now seeking to get flood coverage in the Eastgate area is probably going to have to pay a little bit more than they would have a year ago. Yeah, so typically what you're going to run into if a general commercial lines policy, probably like the one that you have, is you're going to have, if you have a business insurance endorsement that's going to cover, excuse me, business interruption endorsement, if you're going to have coverage for that, it's going to identify, what the policy limits are. So you have to look at the complete policy to sort of figure out what you've got. You're going to have your declarations that are going to establish the amount of coverage that you have for the specific policy provisions. Business interruption is going to have a limit to it. And then typically you're going to have the exclusions in the policy that identify what's not covered. And that's really where the insurance companies try to stick it to people, is saying this isn't covered, this is not covered, that kind of thing. And so it's really important when you're dealing with a claim after the incident has occurred to spend the time to review the policy, to look and see what's covered. And then when you're meeting with your broker at any point in time, make sure that the coverage you are buying is covering everything that you expect it to. Commercial lines policies can be hundreds of pages long. And attorneys like myself who've been doing this for a long time, we have to spend a lot of time reading these things because you have to look at all of the coverages, all of the exclusions to see what's covered, what's not covered, the amount of coverage that's provided. And honestly, and not intending to throw insurance brokers under the bus here, sometimes they don't even understand everything that's included in the policy that they're selling you. Because like I said, they're very long, they can be very detailed. So you need to spend the time, ask the right questions, make sure that exactly what you want covered is covered under your policy so that you don't run into a situation after the fact and say, well, I thought this was covered, only to find out that it's not because of some exclusion that's tucked in the policy somewhere. They're not easy to read. They take some time. You have to connect the dots, look at the different sections throughout the policy to see how they all interplay with each other, to make sure what's covered or what's not covered. So it can be a little overwhelming at times. And certainly in a situation like y'all are probably in, where, you have this event, you're out of business, you're trying to get back into business, you're dealing with a lot of things, spending the time getting to know your insurance policy as intimately as you need to probably is not at the top of your priority list, but it's very crucial that you do that to make sure that you have the coverage that you need. And secondly, when you make a claim, that you get the coverage that you're entitled to under the policy. Because insurance companies will sometimes they'll cut corners and they won't drill down on the policy provisions as much as they need to make a clear coverage opinion. They just like to deny coverage when they hear the word flood. So it may or may not be covered. So you need to spend the time to make sure that what you bought in your insurance is what you're receiving.
Taylor, I also want to mention there's some pretty significant lawsuits coming out of Helene. Some interesting sets of facts because obviously, every flood is different, every disaster is different. And so, a lot of this is a gray area at this point. I mean, we think we know what it means, but some folks are going to test that and try and get coverage that the insurance companies have denied. And ultimately, Chris, that's your only response, right? I mean, if they continue to say no, only the courts can make them say yes.
Yeah, and that's something that we're dealing with a lot up here right now with people that have brought claims, largely business interruption claims, because that's really where you know, the rubber hits the road, so to speak, when it comes to these type of events. And so first place, obviously, is you got to drill down and look at your policy. And like Jamie said, there's some gray area there in regards to the language, the way it's drafted, and things like that. Um, but you have to really look at the policy to see what's covered, what's not covered, and then your avenues. If they continue to deny, you can file a complaint with the Commissioner of Insurance. They will investigate those things. You might not get a lot of traction out of it, but it puts a little bit of heat on the insurance company to take a second or third or fourth look. Um, and then the end result, if you don't get anywhere, is you essentially have to sue your own insurance company for them denying coverage. Now, that does not come without a cost, unfortunately. Um, but the insurance companies have a lot at risk in those cases because largely they are centered around allegations of bad faith for failure to pay the policy that you have been paying a premium on. And so that puts them in a very awkward position sometimes because they don't want to have to open up their file to explain their coverage decisions. Because sometimes people find things that they don't want really to see the light of day. Um, but ultimately, at the end of the day, that's your only recourse if they continue to deny coverage is to sue them if there's grounds for that. But like I said, you have to begin and sort of end with the insurance policy to see what's covered, what's not covered, to know whether there's, legitimate grounds to argue that there should be coverage.
Brooks has her hand up, so I'll pivot to her. I also want to say it's kind of funny because the question I was going to ask was actually directed towards you next. So I'll let you respond and then I'll ask the question for you.
Alrighty, yeah. I had a couple things. I was taking some notes. So I popped some links in the chat for folks that are going to be helpful. Following up really quick on the insurance piece, I put a link in there for disaster mediation with NCDOI. I found that this was actually very helpful immediately after the storm with Helene. I'm not as on the ground as I was a year ago, so I won't speak to how claims are panning out now, but I will say NCDOI was very helpful. And the mediation program was helpful for homeowners that I helped in this space, in the sense that, like what Chris was saying, if you're not getting traction, this is a way to help force a dispute resolution in a way that's not going to spend tons of time. Let's just be honest, but the time it takes to actually litigate that dispute and the money it would take. So definitely looking at that, and also just getting NCDOI involved can put some pressure in a way that folks will want to resolve that dispute. So there's that one. Other common pitfalls. I agree with everything that's been said about tying the type of damage that you have received, making sure that is aligned or evidencing an alignment in a way that falls under a covered event type in your policy. So, and this is where lawyers, we get to play a lot and we get to have fun and do what we like to do, and play with the gray area. So for example, you don't have flood insurance. Okay, you don't have it, but I'm sure you received wind or wind-driven rain damage, because flooding doesn't just happen out of nowhere in these types of situations, right? If you're talking about a depression, tropical storm, or hurricane, you've got wind and wind-driven rain and also flooding. So maybe look throughout the other types of damage that you have and tie as much of that damage to the type of claim that's covered in your policy. Just get the most out of your policy that you can. So we've seen success with that. I put a link in there for a webinar on pre-disaster planning. For business folks who are watching this, you've got your operating agreement, or you should, or the equivalent of that, depending on the type of entity you formed. In that space, when you're thinking about the types of agreements you set in place in what we like to call blue sky times, also consider your disaster provisions. So your continuity planning, how are you going to have your operations move forward in the event of an emergency? And, for many of us, especially out west or maybe in the central area, if you're not on the coast, you probably haven't really needed to consider disaster provisions, but now we're almost all put on notice at this point that it's something that could happen. So when you have a minute, or maybe it's, at the time of your annual filing and you're just looking again during the regular course of, business operations on looking at what's going on and updating your documents, maybe consider and then put a tickler in there for yourself to think about what type of disaster related planning do you need to be doing. Again, looking at your policies to get the boost coverage that you think you're going to need. And then I wanted to speak on SBA. So a common pitfall that I see is, since we've been talking about businesses, while FEMA is extremely helpful in the sense of it opens up federal opportunities for funding, it's targeted towards individuals and homeowners for their individual assistance programs, or public assistance, so local units of government, state government. Less so for private businesses, and that's where the Small Business Administration comes into play, and you've got SBA disaster loans. I put a link in the chat for how to navigate to the SBA search page where you can search for Chantal. There are 2 that are going to pop up. That's okay. That's because SBA doesn't have to follow the same types of sort of turnkey mechanism on, it can do things before a major disaster declaration. There's some flexibility for the SBA to administratively declare in their own space. So that's why there are 2 different types of resources available under SBA right now for Chantal. The main difference that you're going to see there is just deadlines. And so the main claim pitfall here is just missing a deadline. So there are 2 main disaster loans available: economic injury and physical. Take a look at those types of declarations under SBA and the deadlines associated with each, and see, obviously what would work best for you if you wanted to engage with SBA for loan assistance. Generally speaking, SBA can be a good option because it's going to have lower interest rates than private funding.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually going to follow up with some advice regarding that. First and foremost, it's really important for people to document the loss. Photographs of every aspect of it. Try to determine the cause of loss. As Brooks was talking about, storm events come not just with flooding, but there can be wind damage and things like that that can affect your ability to remain open. If the winds are knocking down power lines or things like that, those might be covered losses, whereas flooding might not be. So you need to document everything related to the loss that you can possibly think of. And don't feel like going overboard isn't necessary. Document everything. And secondly, in addition to that, you need to look at and document things related to access to your property. If the city, the town, the state, whatever, is denying access, or it's inaccessible for a variety of reasons, you might not be able to physically take a photograph of the tree that's blocking the road or things like that. But if the town, the county, the municipality issues any kind of orders or directions regarding access to property, copy those, save those, build a file that has everything you can find related to your inability to be operational, supporting the fact that you are out of business. Like I said, be that photographs, be that news articles, be that press releases, be that something from the landlord that says you can't access the property because the town told us we are condemned until further notice. Anything related to access to the property or that affects your ability to operate, document that as much as you possibly can. And then the other thing is, go ahead and put your insurance company on notice of the loss. You want to get your local agent on the hook to make sure they're aware of it. They need to put the carrier on notice. A lot of times they will want to send out adjusters to take a look at the condition, the loss, things like that. So go ahead, get them on notice, and then start getting your ducks in a row, trying to figure out, like, if for a business interruption claim, how much business interruption loss you have incurred. And that might, going back and looking at your books, depending upon the business you're in, how much revenue you would typically generate on a typical period of time that you've been out of business. Be proactive. Don't wait for them to ask for it. Go ahead and start getting that all together, because you're going to need to provide that information to the insurance company. So getting a jump on it is always a good thing.
I'll add a little bit more there. Not on the insurance side, but just speaking generally, your lease will have provisions and procedures that you need to follow with respect to your landlord. Your landlord may not be particularly local, especially if you don't have a property manager that's local. And there are frequently provisions in your lease that require you to notify the landlord of something that's happened before certain timeframes start tolling. And depending on what your lease says, they're all different, but it could be important for triggering landlords' need to start doing their own work, which has to be done before you have to do your work for remediating and reopening. So important to keep them on notice and kind of have good communication with them as you go through that. And frequently, many leases will have a provision in them that if there's a casualty in the final year or two of the lease, that either party can terminate it without penalty. So that's something to be aware of in the event that you really want to utilize it. So important to be at least somewhat familiar with the terms of your lease, so that you know the procedure that you need to follow with respect to that lease, so that you don't end up in default in any sort of way.
And I'll speak a little bit on when we think about our employees. So depending on the size of your business, you might be a business of 2, or you might be a business of 10 or more. But considering beyond safety precautions, realistically, depending on the disaster and type of damage, what are you going to need to do to support your employees? And are you going to have to essentially suspend operations for a significant amount of time before you're able to get up and running again? So in that sense, there is often disaster unemployment assistance that will pop up depending on the scope and severity of the disaster. So you might need to refer your employees to some DUA opportunity. And, another thing too, depending on if your physical location, and even we're seeing more issues in the sense of disability claims in the virtual space. So your website might be down for some reason. You may need to consider pretty quickly posting, whether through socials or any other avenue that you have, that your operations are suspended, or that things might not be safe. Don't come by the physical location, what have you, so you can avoid any liability there, or any access issues that may pop up. And I bring up disability in the sense of it might take some time. Let's say your front steps had a railing that was available, or a side ramp that was available for consumers who had a disability. That might be completely destroyed, and you're going to need some time to fix that. Put folks on notice of that. And again, considering, the needs of your employees during that time as well.
So Taylor, it's really a triple disaster. I mean, obviously the employees lose their jobs or livelihood for a period of time, or maybe forever if the business doesn't reopen. The business owner, I mean, you own a jewelry store and then have to move across town and try and rebuild, that's incredibly difficult. And the property owners as well. I mean, obviously this was a huge casualty loss. The rent income is interrupted. There's a lot of issues out there. Scott, what kind of negotiations did you see for Helene from the landlord and the tenant side to try and work out basically an unexpected disaster?
I've seen lots of different ones because, like I said, every lease tends to be different. A lot of the negotiations were trying to effectively get out of the lease. It was going to be a long restoration of the property. There were a couple properties that I dealt with that were particularly close to either Swananoa or the French Broad, and they were we're talking about very large buildings being pretty much entirely underwater, and significant damage associated with that. So usually it was negotiating an exit, and the sooner we were able to get into that, the better we were able to determine an outcome sooner, which is always cheaper. And it's good to get a picture of what the landlord is going to expect and want, and be able to kind of try to figure out a middle ground that will work for them, and that isn't too painful on our end. Since obviously insurance proceeds were an issue, even areas that did have insurance for flood insurance, it wasn't enough. The amount of the policy wasn't enough to really make a difference, even though there was a payout of some sort. And I'm still dealing with some of these negotiations, so it's an ongoing thing that will probably exist for a while, because a lot of rebuilding in certain areas still hasn't even really begun, because insurance payouts have maybe only just started to actually happen. So it's not a quick process unless you're able to terminate the lease sooner. And I was able to do that, use that, that provision that I talked about a minute ago about the ability to terminate within the final year of the lease. That was particularly helpful, made it a lot simpler of a negotiation, just trying to get personal property out of the space, which was all pretty much a loss anyway. But so it like I said, it really depends on the lease and depends on the circumstance. They're all different, but I've seen the entire range in the last year.
I think you go for everything available to you. There's no guarantee, there's no certainty that any avenue you pursue is going to provide you with funds or recovery in any way, shape, or form. What people up here have been doing, and what I think is probably the appropriate way to do it, is you figure out what all is available potentially, and you apply for all of it and see what plays out. Some might be the shorter term, some might be the longer term. You're not going to know until you jump into the process what kind of money you can recover. Through your insurance, through SBA loans, through FEMA, whatever is available, I would recommend pursuing all of those avenues, because some might play out, some might not. Don't, box yourself in unnecessarily.
Fantastic.
I'd say if you're there is, when it comes to federal funding sources, there is a very specific sequence of delivery and time frame that happens. And for those of y'all, who've been impacted recently by disaster, Helene was more on our radar up front. So we may not have known at the time of the impact how widespread it was going to be, but we knew it was going to be a bad storm. That being said, Chantal, we didn't know it was going to be that bad. And so, and you'll see that reflected in the declaration date stamps, right? It happened back in June, July, but you just got your major disaster declaration at the federal level last week. So, and this is, in September. That's actually pretty fast when you think about it. From what I've seen so far, for smaller scale storms, that's a pretty fast turnaround actually. But that takes some time, and so because of that, there's a very specific sequence of delivery that the federal government follows, and that being they expect folks to first rely on insurance. So your first priority will be to capture what's already on the table. You've paid into it; it's yours. Fight for it. So what we talked about before. Document damage, document the source of damage, align it to your policy as best you can, report it, and go ahead and get and capture as much as you can through insurance. And then from there, cast the net wide for your federal options, maybe even state options, depending on what's popping up, or a nonprofit might be able to come in. But it's all very parallel to each other. While you're casting that net wide and applying for opportunities, you've got to mitigate your damages as well. You can't let something that may have been, a roof leak issue. You can't not try to address that and then let it turn into an entire rebuild because mold infestation has captured it, a year later. So do what you can to mitigate your damages and your loss, while you're also applying for all of these things. And that is sort of the unfortunate reality of a disaster recovery space, is that it feels like chaos, because in a lot of ways it is. You're navigating some very serious life safety and loss concerns. At the same time, you've got to prepare yourselves as best you can for your long-term recovery, and also prevent liability issues, as far as, folks doing workers' comp claims because they were trying to work or get to work in an unsafe situation, or you unfortunately are moving too fast, don't vet a contractor, and then you lose out on some of your insurance funds because your contractor ran off with your money. Now you've got a contractor fraud issue. So it's a lot going on, and it can feel very overwhelming, but at the same time, you just kind of have to do a lot of different parallel actions all at the same time. But the good news is it's not like that forever. It's just only, unfortunately, in those immediate moments, you got to do what you got to do. I can pick up that a little. So I hear that concern. I will say, during Helene, some of y'all might remember this if you were impacted and you were navigating SBA. There was some time during immediate Helene recovery between October and February. There, SBA and FEMA work really closely together, and they'll often be in disaster recovery centers together, physically with their own representatives there. SBA actually suspended operations during immediate response because at the federal level, it trickled down that they were out of funds. They didn't have enough money. They forecasted their budgets, and they didn't think they had enough money to continue on offering applications. So they actually stopped operations and accepting applications for a little time. I think it eventually reopened, but I say that as a real life example of, the agency will do what it can to forecast its budget, forecast the anticipated amount of applications, what the budget they still have is, and they will pause operations or accepting new applications when they think they're reaching a threshold that they can't sustain. So there's some safety and assurances in that, but at the same time, there's really no guarantee. And that's an unfortunate reality along all of those federal programs, is it's like a big disclaimer, like no guarantee at all. And that's why it's, we often say, cast that net wide, throw your hat in the ring, but don't rely on it. It can't be guaranteed that you're going to get a fast return. And it certainly can't be guaranteed that you'll be accepted. And even if you are, when is that money going to hit for you? And how long will it pay out? I will say, though, at the point that you've been accepted and that you've signed for your loan, then at that point, I think you've got some assurances, right? But up until you've locked it in, unfortunately, there's really no guarantee. And so you kind of have to fall back and consider that as a part of the long-term planning of, okay, we applied for SBA. Here's our plan, maybe D, of what happens if we just never receive that money or if that funding stops.
I'll chime in first. Kind of like what I talked about earlier, document your loss. Photographs, documentation, search the internet for civil authority interruptions, anything like that. As much information as you can get your hands on to document your loss, your damages, the cause of loss. That will benefit you so much down the line when you get into the inevitable process of dealing with your insurance company.
Thank you, Chris.
I'll go next. communicate with your landlord sooner than later and be familiar with your lease, all the terms and provisions of your lease.
Thank you, Scott.
Know your deadlines. Apply if you're going to apply for any federal or state programs. Find the deadline and make sure you submit that application on time. It's a lot easier to supplement an application for eligibility purposes than to try to say, you miss the deadline and you still want to get it in. So apply within your window.
Thank you, Brooks. Oh, James, you're talking, but you're muted. You're still muted.
I should have learned how to use this stuff by now.
There you go.
There's a map that's out, and I think I may have shared it with you guys just now, that shows all the disasters and what's the worst disaster for every area. And there were a third of the state had their biggest disaster this year. So it's going to happen again. So, be prepared for next time. Be prepared for next time. It's going to happen again.